get to them, we'll save them and use them in the group and stuff. All right. Oh, now we're on Facebook. Got to turn off the thing. All right, Tom, so you can share it on off the Facebook. Done. Got that. All right. How are all you doing? Once Tom is
I'm ready to roll.
You're ready to rock. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You're a speedy sharer.
Doing my best.
Doing your best. Excellent. Now let's pull that up. Excellent. It's good. Well, Larry from North Carolina. That's what I'm talking about. I love North Carolina. It's got like tons of my favorite people in it, Tom.
Yeah, you have some folks in that part of the world. It's a little far from Idaho, but I do have friends in North Carolina.
I know. Now, let us hit record and boom. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Thomas J. Oord, one of my kindest and smartest friends. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of God questions you've been sending in. We've got so many that we're going to not get to all of them, but we're saving them, and we'll be covering them in our upcoming class called Becoming Christian. Tom, what is that going to be about? Because when they have fun with us right now, whether they're listening live, listening on podcasts later, or whatever, if they want to join and hang out with us over February and March, why don't you tell about that? Why they go to openandrelationaltheology.com.
Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that you and I like challenges. And in this particular course, we're taking on the challenge of interpreting the Apostles' Creed, one of the oldest and most cited, CITED, most cited creeds in Christianity. It's a creed that has some lines that you and I are not quite sure we want to affirm, but we're trying our best. And what makes it particularly interesting is you and I come from an open and relational theological perspective, and that perspective has many forms, but it does have a particular way of thinking about issues like God's power, God's love, who Jesus was, the kinds of things that the creeds either talk about or don't talk about and make us angry because they overlook them.
Yeah, it happens. We got to give a shout out. See, Lee is on. So's Vanna in North Carolina, another North Carolinian represent. Oh, Brian, he just hollered. Brian moved up to Pennsylvania, I think. Anyway, so what we got sent in a whole bunch of questions. And so we're going to take turns picking questions where the other one has to answer. So, and then the other one, if they want to respond or add anything on or let the other one know they're a heretic, then that's possible. So I'm going to ask you the first question, Tom. You muted yourself, so you got to unmute yourself to answer your question. But this question comes from the Twitter. Brogressive asks, who is a closeted Southern Baptist youth minister. This is his allowed to tweet at you and I
The
in
hard
public.
questions.
Yeah. So this question asks, when, and I guess this is a little presumptive, when we confirm extraterrestrial life with a higher level of sentience than ours, what goes through the open and relational theologian's brain?
I think what most open and relational theologians will say once we find higher intelligence, greater sentience is we kind of expected that. It's not a big surprise. It's not like we think God is only interested in what happens in our little planet and our little corner of this particular universe. I think God is interested in it, but If we really think God is omnipresent and the creator of all, and if we think that there's something true about an evolutionary process in which creatures cooperate well or poorly with their creator, it could be quite likely there are other creatures who did a better job of cooperating or more quickly than we did. So I don't think it'll surprise many open and relational theologians if such sentient beings are discovered. Would you agree?
Yeah, and yeah, I actually, kind of what came to my mind is, yeah, it should be the case, right? Especially if you look at uh, a lot of the SETI research and looking at where, like, the number of Earth-like planets where life could emerge and all that kind of stuff, you'd expect it to be the case. There's probably ones that are further along than us. If that's the case, I do think it says something about it is a kind of a challenge to more reductive accounts of evolution,
Sure.
in that, like in the same way that it's harder to explain certain biological features when they evolve in a multiple places independently. It in a sense says something about the uh, it's one it could elicit a desire for I don't know, evaluative interpretation of evolutionary trajectory. Um, and I think if you see life on a multiplicity of planets, then we're not just like the world's greatest Yahtzee of all time, um,
Right.
but uh, we're at home in the universe in a different way. But that also, for certain theological perspectives, decenters human beings. But if we're going to survive on this planet long enough to meet extraterrestrials, we're going to have to decenter human beings anyway. So,
Yeah, good point. Hey, I got a follow up that I got that for you. Dave asks, I can't think of a reason to believe Christianity will last forever. What might be what might come after Christianity? I think that's related to this in terms of evolutionary progress, other forms. Do you think that Christianity is everlasting, and if not, what might come after? I'm asking an open theist to prognosticate here.
well, that I would say, like, the first time that question was raised for me was reading Schleiermacher's fifth speech in On Religion. So Frederick Schleiermacher, in his fifth speech of On Religion, where he's just basically describing to, like, cultured elites who are like, I'm so past baby religion, I'm into art and I have deep culture. Who needs the fuddy-duddy liturgy, right? Like, and he's like cultivating that. No, you don't understand the reason you're turned on in the orchestra and what's going on in art. Like, that's a whole dimension, and you're seeing how you're understanding religion wrong. Religion's goal is not a set of ideas you assent to. Like, it's a form, it's a community, it's a way of ordering one's affect and community, such that you encounter this deep depth dimension. And Christianity, Judaism, these religious traditions have this wisdom they're carrying with it. You don't have access if you don't understand the symbols, signs, rituals, and stuff to get at. And then he goes, but that doesn't mean Christianity is going to be here forever. At some point, he postulates, the evolution beyond it. And like the first time I read that, I was like, huh, that's immediately obvious if, right, you're like, that's no less shocking than the discovery the earth isn't that old, right?
Yeah.
The other time that idea came up to me that I found really helpful is how in John Cobb's Christ in a Pluralistic Age, he looks at the intensity, right, in which the eternal Logos, the word that was made flesh, was in Jesus, but also the way in which the primordial nature of God, or God's deepest desires coming to each moment, becomes what he calls creative transformation. Then what does that look like in community? For Christians, we've encountered God's deepest wisdom and desire and justice and beauty in this particular tradition, mediated in this particular person. But is that, like, eternal word that echoes moment to moment, relationship to relationship, going to get closed off in a religion on this planet? No. Are any of them final expressions? No. And so, like, in one sense, I would kind of hope we do that,
Yeah.
I don't think that decenters what we're getting at when we have encounters and have a deep faith in within the Christian tradition, the present. Otherwise, we wouldn't decide as people that are non-creedal to go line by line through the creed,
Yeah.
right? You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Good point. It could be also, or at least I'll say for my own part, it could be I actually believe there are aspects of reality, of existence, that do transcend, that continue on no matter what form of religion is, present in the world. Like the grasping or searching after greater values, or I think freedom is something that's going to be here forever and ever, or maybe relationality. I think that'll be a component. So no matter what, if Christianity stays around or if it leaves, whatever is sort of the center of our orienting religious concerns, I think will include these, I'm calling them transcendent dimensions of life.
Yeah. So now is that going to count as your question,
No, that
or
was
is that
kind
a
of
follow up?
jumping on you. We're supposed to follow up on each other. So I was
Okay, I
following
was
up
just
on.
making. I didn't know if like when you brought Dave's question in,
Oh,
if
that
that
was.
was.
Oh, I see. I
I
misunderstood.
don't know the
Oh,
rules of our game. That
that's true.
they're very open rules. Yeah.
All right, I'll ask you a second one.
All right.
One of these. mm, ooh, doo, 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 Kirsten asks this: how can we talk about faith in the specific divine purpose of Jesus's life and other things in such a way that it doesn't impugn God's character and relationship with people who are not Christians? So I think she's asking, look, Christians put all this emphasis and weight on Jesus and making all these grand claims, and Jesus, somehow God has a special relationship with this guy from Nazareth that you wrote a whole book on recently called Divine Self-Investment. How do you put all your focus and all your energy and your enthusiasm in that idea without subtly sort of discounting or in some way minimizing other religious traditions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I remember the first time I had to ask myself that because I grew up in rural North Carolina, right? So until we moved to Raleigh, the capital, which is only a capital in certain areas, like it's the same size as like, it's anyway, it's not a huge city, but like in rural North Carolina, my religious diversity was the variety of Baptist you were, you know? So it wasn't till I had a Jewish friend that the question like became a live one, right? And in my time in middle school and high school at an art magnet school, I ended up learning what like elements of how to practice your faith from devout Jewish friends of mine. And so that occasions this question because underneath it, I saw in the way their own faith, the keeping of Sabbath when it was difficult in a theater production, the times that they have fast and celebrations, the way you would get invited to certain things and not to others as a Gentile, and they would invite me and then it'd tell me about the meal and the celebration and stuff. And then the way they asked generous questions about my own family's faith when they came for meals. And anyway, like so much of it you're sitting there going, whatever you're getting done in that tradition is really resonating with what I'm doing in mine. And yet there's that one element in Christianity where people like, I don't know, they bold and underline John 14:6 and then misinterpret it completely.
Yeah.
And then use it to be a giant jerk to large numbers of their friends, right? I am the way, truth, and life. But and what struck me in processing it was I was talking to my friend Raphael, and we were talking about going to prom, right? And we were talking about, I had a girlfriend at that point, not always okay, it didn't last long usually, but nonetheless, I wasn't looking for a date. And then he had broken up with his girlfriend, but we had like a couple really good friends who was talking about how, what should I ask one of them? And he's like describing our relationships, our friends. We want to have a lot of fun when we go. And I just realized like there was nothing about his relationship with them and my relationship with them that like threatened the integrity of each. And then I like went home and realized I was like talking to my dad about it, giving me like fatherly wisdom. And he goes and says, yeah. Well, I don't expect like my friends to hear me talk about how much I love your mother, and then they want to marry her. Like I just want them to go, oh, he really does love her, right? And and I think that's like a way of helping to frame this, is that as a Christian, my encounter with God is so shaped by Jesus and the story of Christ and the Christian tradition that I couldn't answer that question without talking about Jesus. But that doesn't mean I haven't met people in other religious traditions and people that don't have a normal one where I go, I understand, right? Where that affection, that devotion goes. And I don't feel like they have to be competitive, but for some reason we think religions are inherently competitive. And yet these other things where we only have one, hopefully for our whole life, and are radically committed to it, deep fidelity, we don't. And they're called partners. So like that analogy really helped me think it through. Anyway, what came to your mind?
Well, I like your analogy a lot. I was thinking about the question on the impugning God's character. And your answer, I think, kind of pushes in the direction I would want to go, which is, I think God loves everybody the same. It's not like God loves Jesus followers more than Muhammad followers or something like that. But you kind of put the focus on your own subjective experience of reality and what clicks for you, what makes sense for you, where your passion and your heart is personally. You're not making a claim that everybody ought to be exactly like you. And I think that's the way to go. That doesn't impugn God's character. It just says, given who I am, given the things I'm attracted to, given my past, this Jesus guy is really central to me. It doesn't have to be for everybody else. I don't walk in your shoes, but for me, this guy is at the center. Now it's up to you to ask.
Oh, no, I think that's good. And, there's so many elements to that Christology question. Also, this was a
We
different
could go
answer
all day.
than Tom and I've been working on the beginning of the class. And the whole first line, right, is I believe. And that's really connected to this conversation we had, and it goes in a different direction. So definitely bring it back up if you're in the group. And everyone should know the group we're doing, going line by line through the creed, is pay whatever you can between 0 and 1 million, not more than 1 million, no less than 0. We're not paying you. But if you go to Open and Relational Theology, you can openrelationaltheology.com. You can join, and you can wait till the end before you give us 1 penny. And that's when you decide that it wasn't complete heresy. We didn't ruin your life. And I have, so.
Yeah, unlike some politicians who have their donation level somewhere around 2,000, we've jumped up. We're playing with the big boys. We're at 1 million. Now, if you go to 2 million, I'm sorry, you could probably do some sleazy campaign kind of backdoor stuff, but at least in public, anything over 1 million, we can't take it.
Yeah. I just want everyone to know Tom was the one that opened up the possibility of backdoor donations.
Oh my.
It's live. You can't say anything, Tom. So here's a question, Michael, who I know is on. This is the one he emailed, even though he's messaged others. My question is, where can I find hope right now? I listen to the news obsessively, and all I can see is evil ascendant, collapse, ruin. I'm used to a story about America where wrongs are righted and good prevails, but even though Biden's president and doing good things, they seem fragile and temporary rather than signs of solid progress. So how does how does an open and relational perspective kind of frame not just this moment, but how one shows up to it and the challenges that are going on? Plus, I'm interested in how you see things. Come on.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe I'll start with kind of a very general kind of approach and then maybe work down to a few examples. I think open and relational theologians generally, maybe even all of them, want to avoid two extremes. One extreme says our hope is entirely in God. God's got to fix things single-handedly. We don't have anything to contribute because we're sorry suckers bound for hell, utterly depraved, yada, yada, yada. But hope is only in what God can do. The other side is that hope is entirely on our shoulders. If it's to be, it's up to me. God's left the party. God's not involved in history in our lives. And so we just got to grit it out, fight it out, piece it out, hug it out, whatever it is. It's up to us to get things done. Most open and relational theologians are going to say, there's some kind of combination involved here. Some, like me, will say God acts first and makes possible a positive response that then provides hope in overcoming the difficulties of our time. One of the other, I think, more abstract questions that we always have to deal with is an epistemological one. That is, how do we know exactly what direction to go for things to get better? Two people can look at the same event and one person find it hopeful because they think it's heading the right direction, and the other person get depressed. That's a difficult one, I think, that no matter who you are, you have to wrestle with. And as a Christian, there are certain Christian practices, resources, and things that can help us to discern, but I don't think it ever gives us a 100% crystal clear answer to what's the right action for hope. So that's kind of general. Maybe I'll just say one thing specific, and let you weigh in on this, Tripp. Um, for me personally, the times I feel most hopeful are the times in which I think people are cooperating with this lure of love, this beacon of beauty. Oh, I'm getting some alliterations going here. I've got to come up with one for truth. This trajectory of truth. There we go. Got all three in. When I see actual people doing good and loving others, I assume the God of the universe has called them, inspired them, empowered them. And those little acts of kindness end up making me hopeful for a better future. Your thoughts, Tripp?
Yeah. So when I think of where I can find hope right now, and I just want to, most, if regular podcast listeners won't be surprised, but I was on the, yeah, I'm thrilled for Biden because the other option's Trump, but otherwise, he's just like kind of stale neoliberalism, and I don't think he's like built for, echoing my values deeply. But here's the thing: I think from an open relational perspective, I would say is, you can only be responsible for the horizon of your own agency, what you have the ability to contribute into any moment. And so what it means to put your hope in God in any moment is to try to, with Jesus, with Mama Mary, is to pray, not my will, but thine be done. To let the same mind be in you that is in Christ Jesus. Like, hope has to do with choosing to participate in God in whatever way. And given the options that were available to us in the last month on this planet, given the influence America has, and as Americans, what possible trajectories were there if votes shifted a little differently? If the black church in Georgia didn't step up and step out and go to the voting box and shift the Senate, there are so many things that are going to be different just because we are making a little bit of difference now. Other things become possible. It doesn't mean there's not plenty of other stuff to work on, but if you just look at the spectrum of possibilities that were available 3 months ago to the ones available now, you have to be like, we're making progress. That sets a stage for new things to become, new possibilities to be available that weren't. If you just take the political example, the other of if the Senate hadn't flipped, if there wasn't a different president. But the other side of it is this: an open and relational person also needs to think through, in what ways have I contributed to the deflation of possibilities for my community? And so while it is easy to make plenty of jokes about a QAnon dude with sweet horns, like, in what ways has our religious community, in what ways has the actual fabric of America relationally deteriorated because of lockdown, the internet, monetizing our anxieties, filtering us into algorithms? In what ways are we just passive and complicit at the deterioration of civic life and neighborly existence? In what ways have we let the market determine how we relate to the environment, how we relate to most of our neighbors we impact? All those things are there. And so I think there's the open relational perspective. How do I contribute in this moment? Are we seeing trajectories that are more responsive? And then there's the let's take stock and see how have I contributed. So I put all those there. But the biggest reason I have hope is that there's no present where God is not fully invested as a God of love in the next moment. And you could go, to Sheol and back. So
Yeah.
I'm going to avoid lapsing into preaching. This is it's lockdown's not good in another country for someone who's used to preaching regularly. So if you're a minister and want a Sunday off, holler at church. Like I got sermons just stacked up, ready to explode. All right.
I got a worship question. Actually, a couple people send in these worship questions. Two are very similar, so I'm going to ask them back to back. Chris asks this, Tripp. If God is not a person, but the very ground of being in whom we live and move and have our being, who or what exactly are we worshiping? And Kirsten asks, why is it a good thing to worship God? Got some worship questions for you. God's not a person. Who are we worshiping? Yeah. And is it good to worship this God?
Okay, two things. Which way should we go? Tom, you realize exactly how many questions are entailed in those two, and I can see you smirking. All right. So about the ground of being thing, open and relational theologians don't want to reject the ground of being in a sense of God as source for generative possibilities, creative advance, new beginnings to each ending. Like if you go through, if the person's thinking of Paul Tillich's ground of being language, I would just say Paul Tillich becomes a pseudo process person in volume 3 of his systematic theology and doesn't admit it. But all that's going to get worked out, I think, in an upcoming homebrewed class on Paul Tillich with John Tatominal. We're going to work all that. I told him, I was like, I'll talk about whatever you want for 5 sessions, as long as we, figure out Paul Tillich and Whitehead's relationship in volume 3, his doctrine of the Spirit. But here's what isn't available in ground of being theology, for at least from an open relational perspective. That is God's self-thematization in any particular moment. And what that means is there is a sense for open and relational theologians that God tells you who God is in particular ways. And that has to do with the valuation of possibilities available moment to moment, right? Like the lure is not value free, and it's also contextually situated. When someone is evaluating possibilities for a contextual situation, that's not less than personal. That's not depersonal. That is personal, but not like a person, right? Like God has a single location, but it's personal in the sense that God's investment in each moment is contextualized and situated to our own materially embodied location, our collective embodied situation. And so open and relational theologians want to say more than ground of being theology, for a number of reasons. But I think that's especially important when it goes to worship. And so here's the big contrast, I would say, between open and relational theologians, especially as a mainline Protestant. This is different for evangelicals. They don't have a problem having at least somewhat personal deity. Mainline Protestants, we do. We're extremely theocentric, probably moral therapeutic deists with Jesus sauce on top. Jesus is our salt. Anyway, for open relational theologians, the worship is part of cultivating the way you engage the world, right? So it's what you attend to and it's how you show up. Worship has to do with that. Worship also has to do with growing in awareness to the one who knows you and loves you completely, right? And worship is connected to cultivating and shaping your own way of being in the world such that it coheres with the invitation Jesus gives his disciples. And we'll talk more about this in the class, but I'll just say quickly is that for me, one of the biggest problems with the way ground of being or other types of theology shape mainline worship is that Jesus taught his disciples to relate to the universe as if God is Abba, a loving parent, deeply invested moment to moment, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And he said, when you pray this way, right? our Father. When you give this way. When you fast this way. All those things are tied up in cultivating attentiveness to the kingdom of God coming moment to moment. And it's a deeply parental image. So I think the worship thing, for me, is tied to being in a community where your piety is shaped around the one Jesus calls Abba. But like, I also just say that as someone that's been my experience. So I know plenty of Christians that's not the case. I've already got a text message from someone telling me this, but I'll just say, like, but a lot of our friends, Tom, would probably just list off all the social science reasons that it's good to participate in worship. Like there's plenty of other reasons to why worship. But the other thing, and I wonder how you put this, but I see worship in part as a community cultivating gratitude for all the things that we easily set aside, treat as our own when it's not, and attending to the gift of existence. And that's something I think that goes across traditions, but Christians do it in a real particular way that I grew up and learned. So
yeah. I think I liked all that you said. I'd only had one thing, and for me, it's actually a really important thing. And I came to realize this probably 20 years ago. I was in the middle of a church service. We were singing praise songs. We were talking about how God was so mighty and so loving and present and all these kinds of attributes. And I was thinking to myself, okay, God knows everything we've already said. If it's true, God knows God is mighty and loving and present. Are we just kind of reminding ourselves of God's attributes? I mean, nothing wrong with that, but is worship just sort of a group reminding? And then I realized that the open and relational perspective says that God is actually affected by what we do. And man, that has made all the difference in my worship. Like when I'm in the midst of, I'm in I'm a low church kind of worship service and we do and say and we do things that are more dramatic and exuberant. And I imagine God being pleased by my worship, that my worship actually, jacks up God in some way. And that's a motivator for me beyond reminding myself of certain divine attributes or actually sometimes, debating whether or not I should sing the words that come across the screen because I don't know if I agree with them. When I do agree with something and sing it with gusto, I think God is pleased.
Do you think part of it is that the logic of worship has this division in it where some people experience worship as something God demands or God needs or like you have to do and perform.
Yeah.
And then there's this element where like worship's not necessary, but it's beautiful. Worship's not required, but it's like the cherry on top. Like it's not, you can live without it, but you live better with it. Right. Like, and I feel like that's true about most of our relationships. So,
I like that.
I don't have to like, a friend of mine, we've been friends a long time. We do lots of things together occasionally in, like we have similar passions and work together on stuff and all that kind of stuff. But it was also his birthday and we aren't really working together right now. But I also like reached out to him to tell him happy birthday and sent I was like, here's 3 things I can say thank you to you for that I don't know if anyone else can. Right. And I sent this text. It was a funny back and forth, but that wasn't required.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And when your kids like give you something, it's not like you're like, wow, thanks, Haven, my 3-year-old. I was hoping for the 15th picture I can't decipher. but that's not the point, right? And so I feel like that division where some people experience worship as like a demand, a necessity, and others experience it.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, that's how I think about ethics in general. Like, if you tell me I have to do something, it's my duty. Like, I have this rebellious streak in me that says, well, give me a reason why I should do it. What's the purpose? What are the outcomes we hope to expect? That will motivate me. Just telling me I have to because it's my duty doesn't motivate me much.
There's a 100% chance right now, if once I get some shots, that I would love to even sing Gnostic Redeemer myth hymns in a circle with people, knowing that the great hermeneutic of love can operate even in that, because
Beautiful.
I miss the collective getting together and worshiping, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Yeah.
deeply.
There's something to it.
All right, Tom, I have a question for you.
Lay it on me.
This is from Annie. Annie asks, I choose ORT, open relational theology, every day, despite not ever experiencing what I perceive to be God's relational nature. What can be said for those who experience divine hiddenness, such as myself?
Phew, that's a tough one. Real tough one. Andy, thanks for putting that on us. Because, people do have different experiences of God. And one might think that it's God who decides how much to reveal, how much to that God can be experienced. And so maybe God likes Tripp better than you. And so God really lays it on thick and heavy for Tripp, but not much for you. And you don't experience much. I don't think that's the way things work. One also might blame Tripp or blame you for not trying hard enough to experience God, as if, man, and if you just tried harder, you would really experience God's love. And that Tripp, he's really going gung ho 100% all the time. Neither of those explanations work well for me. I think God is always present at all times. And I do think that sometimes we can do practices, we can be a part of communities, we can do meditation. I have this breathing kind of prayer that I do that sometimes I feel God's presence more powerfully. I love to be in nature, and some of those are some of my spiritual highs. It may be that some of the differences are personality oriented. I don't have like the perfect answer for you, Annie, other than saying, I don't think it's because God tries harder with some people than others. And I also don't think that it's always the case that some people don't try hard enough to experience God. Tripp, you got a
Mm.
better answer than I do?
Well, I don't know if I have a better answer. My, I would just say one of the time, or a number of the times as a minister where people share things like Annie shared in the question,
Yeah.
then you realize that there are quite a few people who are deeply committed in their faith and don't have this experiential testimony to share.
Yeah.
And I think part of that problem, a part of where that problem comes from, or maybe something we could include in religious communities to not make that feel like such a deficit, is the is patterns of testimony that are not incessantly experiential.
Hmm.
Right. So if you think of the way people share testimonies in churches, be it even the way, like, it's not bad that most of the people leading worship are also people that are pretty confident God's in this place.
Hmm.
Yeah, but like, I regularly will preach somewhere and I'm like, man, I really hope God is as present as the worship leader is confident, because I'm currently distracted by your out of tune B string. Well, and so I think part of how a whole group of experience feels alien from a particular vision of faith is because they're never voiced in the context of worship. But if you go look at scripture, it's not hard to find Psalms where Annie is feeling more optimistic than the psalmist.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you go to Lamentations, it's not hard. Or like Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
I did this event at one of the churches I worked at, where I interviewed 3 weeks in a row a one was like a deeply Christian apologist who couldn't believe they were going to speak at a UCC church in Los Angeles, and then someone who grew up Christian and then would say they're agnostic, but deeply committed to the values of the congregation they grew up in, and someone who's like an ardent atheist, who also grew up Christian, right? And I was struck by how many people who resonated with the I'm agnostic or ardently atheist, who all of a sudden felt like they had permission to talk to their minister, right? It's like, my wife's really committed to this church. I love handbells. I don't believe there's a God, but I finally I get to be a part. And then a number of those people years later, because their voice got heard, said they started attending to parts of their experience in different ways and recognized God's presence in it. And that started the small group exercise. I would run these things called experiments in truth as a minister. And like with a large church, you can get a lot. If you just need 12 people to sign up for a small group, it's not wonderfully hard, but 500 or 600 people as an option, right? And it was called God spotting for skeptics. And the whole thing was an exercise that we were going to spend 2 months. If we have to name God's presence in our life, what does that look like? And then what does it look like to actually hear it? Yeah. And it's that exercise that actually, it cultivates gratitude. Even people that didn't want to use the word God at the end felt like they were more attentive to their life and stuff. But see, that's only available in community. And so like as an open and relational theologian, when I hear those kind of conversations, so many of them, if you ask follow-ups, are where you are doesn't mean you're in a church where you get to be honest and voice those things, or you have friends to share that stuff with, or like, how do you have a group with intentionality? I'm
going to disagree with you.
Oh, go for it.
I do think community can make a big difference, but I don't think it has to be just be community. Like, I mean, I think like as you were talking, I have another angle to attack Annie's question. It doesn't solve it, but it expands it, or at least it expands the possible answers. I think sometimes it might not be true of Annie, but sometimes what people are expecting as religious experiences is way too narrow. You and I, Tripp, have a mutual friend who, like Annie, has said she hasn't felt very many experiences with God, but she recently had a child, and that had a change in her. I have friends who never hang out in church communities, but I see them in the mountains hiking all the time, and that's their church. Or the mathematician who finds the elegance of equations that points him or her to God. I mean, I think maybe we need to expand what counts as religious experience. Not that you are trying to make it too narrow, but maybe the typical person only thinks kumbaya around the campfire at church camp or something like that.
Yeah, and I guess I'd like, if you're from an evangelical context, me saying I got a bunch of barely Christian UCCers to do a small group experiment called God spotting, like it turned into like discussions about TV shows or figuring out how to apologize to your neighbor. Like it was not like God spotting like when I was in youth group accountability.
Yeah.
Right. But part of that is, and I think the element in Annie's question that is most challenging to me is when it comes from someone whose theological hermeneutic is an open and relational one.
Right.
Because for me, the open relational hermeneutic for thinking about faith and living is how I like have a much deeper awareness and presence and activity of God. And then I'm like, well, if you've already got the open and relational theological perspective, I gonna let Tom explain it. It's like, I'm gonna ask this question, so he has to talk first.
Well, I've got a question for you that's a Jesus question. Are you ready? You're the Jesus expert between the two of us. All right, this comes from JC, and it's about 3 or 4 or 5 sentences. But the first one is the big one. Did Jesus have to die? Not did he die, but was it necessary? In the cultural context, I understand that people believed that a sacrifice was necessary to appease the gods. I guess I'm wondering if Jesus' crucifixion was God accommodating to the culture, or was it something essential? Besides, the resurrection could have happened if death had been by natural causes. So what do you think? Jesus have to die?
Jesus didn't have to die. It wasn't necessary. Um, God, like the essential element is that God has refused to be God without us. God's decision to not be God without us is the way in which that relational dynamic between God and the world brings about things like covenantal partnerships, or the deep faithfulness of Jesus to the one he calls Abba, such that his fidelity becomes the image of the invisible God, such that a world formed by sin, law, and death does kill him, but God didn't need him to die. God desired him to be faithful. And in him being faithful, you see the contrast of the top-down domination system powers that pervert and exploit the world, and the bottom-up affirming, life-desiring, justice-seeking power that the kingdom of God represents. And so the cross isn't necessary. What's necessary, if you're going to use that word, or essential, I like better than necessary, or have to. I don't like have to, but you know what I mean? Like the incarnation, that God gives God's self and eventually comes into the person of Jesus. That is, for me as a Christian theologian, the redemptive event. That the world and God's relationship reaches a synchronicity where it's a full open mouth eschatological kiss. And the Christ event is the eschatological promise that eventually, when sin, law, and death have become subject to the deep fidelity of the divine life, then all of creation is invited into the divine life. God gives God's self, the world receives it fully. I don't. That was my short version, Tom. You're muted still.
That was a really good short version. I mean,
okay.
I agree with everything you said. I don't know that I have that much to add. But it sounds, I think, strange to a lot of Christian ears to hear someone say Jesus didn't have to die. And I suspect it sounds strange because, at least me, I was taught, not only when I was a kid, but when I was in college, certain atonement theories that required a sacrifice, that required paying the penalty, that required Jesus or God to be satisfied, God's wrath to be satisfied, or that, required the devil to be tricked, all these kinds of things. And so it sounded like from all eternity, God had this blueprint plan in which he was going to kill his son, and it was all laid out in advance. Open and relational theologians may not have an agreed upon theory of atonement, but they reject that idea that somehow everything was predetermined. And so in that sense, no, Jesus didn't have to die, like it was metaphysically necessary.
Well, and do you think the one, there's people in the comments who are asking, I have 2 books about this if you're really interested in the long version. There's a couple chapters in the Homebrew Guide to Jesus, and then my new book, Divine Self-Investment, which is like the really, really long version. But if you just want that part, you can read chapter 1, chapter 5, and 6. That's where that is. But or you can become a member of Homebrew Christianity community group where I read it to you and make commentary about myself. But the I think the have to die thing is connected to something open and relational theologians share, even if they understand the cross as a necessary moment. They don't understand the cross as one in which the character of God is set against the Son.
Right.
And so, like, there are some atonement theories, maybe not as many as people think, but at least the ugly versions are ones that imagine the Father being so holy, somebody's got to get hit, right? Yeah. And then if you want God to take out all the wrath so that at least the elect, but maybe you're optimistic about universal salvation, everybody gets in, maybe not the devil, who knows? But then somebody's got to take the punishment, because whatever's in God's character demands that in order for love, grace, salvation to be extended. Open relational theologians in general are like, you're not going to get a conflict between the character of God and the character of Jesus. So
Right.
however you understand the cross, God has to at least be as loving as you see in the life of Jesus.
Right.
And that means you're going to interpret the cross and resurrection, hopefully in the context of Jesus's ministry. And when you do that, you don't have this type of have to moment.
Yeah.
Right. And the
Well
other
said.
thing, the other extension would be for me, is that the synoptic gospels emphasize the disciples getting mad when Jesus decides to go to Jerusalem. And this happens at the Mount of Transfiguration. It's brought up other places, but when it says Jesus set his eyes towards Jerusalem after,
Mm-hmm.
the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus hangs out with Moses. Anyway, when you get that story, then Jesus didn't have to die. Jesus is choosing. What does it mean to be the Christ? Is to go into the heart of perverse power center where religion, society, culture, and state are wound up in a situation that kept them all mutually perverted and determined and seeking after, infatuated with Roman style imperial power. And Peter's like, Jesus, if you go there, they're going to kill you. And he's like, watch this, like he doesn't say like, oh, my bad, and so I
Yeah.
think that the have to makes us miss the decision that Jesus decides as the one embodying the kingdom of God, making it present and building that community, empowering others, then that involves facing down the powers.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Got nothing to add. Everything's been said that needs to be said. Actually, yeah, let me just echo. Tripp's written a lot about these kinds of things, so check out his works.
All right, here's a question. What is a deep conviction you have that you don't like broadcasting because most of your peers are not supportive?
Oh my goodness! So in other words, we're supposed to broadcast what we don't want broadcasted.
Yeah, Tom, there might be a chance I just don't even answer this question as well.
Yeah, like there's a reason why I don't say some things, and now
But
you
this
want
is
me to
just
say
between
them.
me and you. You and I were friends.
How about if we do it this way? How about if we say, let's re-ask the question. What's something that in the past you would have never said, but you do say today? Is that easier for you? It's easier for me.
Well, Tom, you're a lot more strategic with what you say in public than I am.
This is true.
Yeah. So,
oh, yeah. All right. Here's something that only in the last few years I've brought myself to say, well, and I haven't brought, this might be the first thing I've said it in a real public forum. I've said it to people in conversations, but not. I'm pretty committed now to the idea. It's even hard for me to say right now that Jesus is not God, full stop. So if I think God knows everything there is to know, omniscient, is in some way almighty, the most influential, whatever word you want to use about God's power, if God is omnipresent, not just in one place at one time, etc., Jesus doesn't have those attributes. So I've only in recent time, maybe just right now, been able to say, because of my background, probably, that just saying Jesus is God, Jesus equals God, just doesn't do it for me. I'm not saying that Jesus is just like Tripp and me in all ways, but saying Jesus equals God, I just can't do that anymore. I've had problems with it for 30 years, but I've had reasons not to let myself go to that spot.
well, I remember at one point when that conversation came up, like, I just remember saying to you, I just don't know if I've ever thought that was needed,
Yeah. Oh, it was needed in my background for sure.
I know. But when you said it last time, I've been thinking about why it wasn't.
Gotcha.
in my mind. And so here's the distinction. I wonder if this helps. Like some people, when they hear Jesus is God, and then they're like, they do it for, let's say, on behalf of, like Jesus's divinity. And others do it on behalf of the humanity. So if it's Jesus' divinity, then you're saying something like, when we say that, like, as Christians talk about the eternal Son or the second person of the Trinity or whatever that is, like the person Jesus, the Logos becoming Sarx, happened in a moment. The Logos in the beginning was the Word. The Word was God, all that kind of stuff. If you're telling me that homeboy, first century Jewish Jesus, is rolling out with everything the Logos carried, you're like, oof. But that also requires you to have divine invasion for your incarnation that no open and relational theologian is going to do, because it requires this like omnipotent intervention as opposed to like the fruit of God's love. So I feel like that is different than when you think of the debate for most of the early church, where they thought the divinity part minimized humanity.
Yeah, I think
they're protecting the humanity.
Yeah, I get that argument. I think you could have a statement, something like this. I'm not saying this is my view, but you could have something like this.
Project it on me. I'm more than happy.
No, this is, I'm sure it's not yours. God is incarnate in all creation. That sounds like what most open and relational people want to say. But God, the second member of the Trinity, the Son, who has all the attributes God has, shed some of those attributes for a 33-year period and came in Mary's womb to the world without those attributes. So this was still God in the flesh, just had voluntarily given up omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and then took them back up once he ascended or was resurrected, or however you think Jesus left the planet. I think you could, I'm not saying that's my view, but I think you could have that view and be an open and relational theologian.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't have that view either, Tom.
I know you didn't.
I like just to say the doxology of the church, which is, thoroughly Trinitarian, and Scripture itself doesn't require that one can't just be an evolutionary Arian that lapses doxologically into Trinitarian witness.
I wish that were true. I just last night finished reading When Jesus Became God by Rubinstein, came out in 2001, I think. And it's all about the Arian controversies, in the 300s and 400s, and like Constantine, all these battles. And at one time, Arianism is on top, and the next time Athanasius and Alexander, and they're what do they call them? Not casting out, but whatever. Yeah. Excommunicating. So
look, aren't you glad no one's getting excommunicated
or killed?
These days people just get farewelled, and I'm pretty sure that list we've both been on enough already. And you know what I like to put it, Tom? It's like, if you're going to get excommunicated, you're going to get farewelled from Christian nationalist adjacent evangelicalism in America.
Yeah.
Tom and Tripp might be among the most Orthodox Christians in that group.
That's right.
We're so into wanting to get close that we're going to publicly define ourselves as heretics while going line by line through the creed in an attempt to incorporate as much of it as possible. And you can join us in that by going to openrelationaltheology.com. You see that was high quality.
Ooh, that's a transition right
Just
there.
Go to openandrelationaltheology.com. You can sign up, and you can donate absolutely nothing, so you aren't contributing to our heresies, but you can just overlisten, not contribute, and pray for us, right? I don't want to say be lured over to our side, because that would be like tempting you. I just saying pray for us. Someone just said I haven't answered the last question. Now, do I get to answer?
Yes.
Do I get to answer it with something people that don't know me haven't heard me say out loud, or
Whatever you want to do, Tripp.
No, I'm trying to think of something. Okay, here's one. You want to know the question that drives most of me thinking about what the next step in my life is? It is, it is, I'm more and more like confident that the church should plan on how it can do the best job post ecological collapse. And I'm very interested in figuring out a way to create a pilot alternative community to train churches and community leaders of any sort. But my thought is like on how you do more communal development, urban sustainability post collapse, because I'm not optimistic that we're going to avoid some of the deep problems that are going to come post ecological collapse. And I don't normally say these things publicly because then people just try to explain it away. And I'm really just, I'm not saying it's not the worst thing to think about, because if it happens, then like if you take the COVID situation and then add technology doesn't completely function and people can't just deliver you stuff and all this kind of, and we don't have the financial means because for some reason our globe's still built on constant growth as a necessity for financial health, then yeah,
like,
that's
good.
It's like, but there are plenty of things, if you listen to podcasts, that are minority opinions among most of my friends, but I just you know what my approach, Tom, is I try not to take myself too seriously and to be friends with everybody, and that way they tolerate all my minority opinions.
I like it.
My other one is New England IPAs suck. They just suck.
You're really going out there.
New England IPAs suck. I'm tired of it. If you drink one, you can't drink anything else. They aren't that good. They're like bad wheat beer. I'd rather have wheat beer. That's the other hot take.
All right, I got it. I got a question for you. Actually, it's I'm gonna.
No.
Is it my turn to ask you? Yeah.
I was answering the question I asked you.
Yeah. All right. This is like two people ask questions that are related. I'm going to ask them and you can just riff, go whatever direction you want. Tony says, is the same God always represented in the Old Testament? Or do the writers sometimes claim to be speaking for Yahweh when they're in fact making a case for or against their own tribe? And related from John, why did God choose a band of semi-nomadic goat herders to bring his message of salvation to? Even if one follows Jewish culture back quite a ways, there were other cultures worldwide that were likely far more advanced. Would an all-powerful and all-knowing entity pick a better group to spread the message?
Oh, man. So I would take each of those such different directions.
Okay, well, sorry. I thought you could.
Well, I can try to weave them together, Tom. I'm not really good at brevity. Okay, I'll be brief. Then you comment on whatever part you want.
Okay, sounds good. That works.
Because when I was brief on answering the Jesus question, it turned into a fun conversation, even though I felt guilty leaving out all these thoughts I spent 20 pages each working on in the book.
Well, you don't think I'm sharing all my gems with you? And we got to say some things for the class.
Oh, you don't understand, people. Everything here is like level 2 compared to the amazing things. OpenRelationalTheology.com. No. Okay. So the same God in the Old Testament, I would put it this way. The scriptures themselves are always testifying to the same living and life-giving God. What it is like for God to how that testimony has traction with the reality of God as God and God's self varies. I don't think it's a straight historical progression. I think there are trajectories of progress in some sense, but not like if you just line them out to when they happened. Yeah. So I wouldn't want to say like, I would say when you're reading scripture, God's a character. And That doesn't mean there's not a God. It's just that
Right.
it's not like a one-to-one. One of the things I think open relational perspective helps you realize is like every moment, be it the moments in history behind the text or a moment of God in the world. So they're both always accommodating to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Every moment of editing and composition of the scriptures is the same thing, right? When Israel's in exile, editing the Hebrew scriptures, the context of Babylonian exile deeply shapes how they retell their stories and edit it and put it together for formation. Then each time those texts are brought up, or a moment of an encounter between God and the world. So when we read texts today, we're not reading them as the history that happened then, or even all the moments in it. We're reading it with all that in our past in the present, which is why we're going to talk about the creed. But like, it could be like we picked like embarrassing passages to exegete or anything.
Yeah.
Like all those things are part of our present with our religious identity as Christians. Then it's how do you attend to them? How do you receive them? How do you interpret them? In what ways they become alive? How does God take up these scriptures anew? When it goes to God choosing Israel, I would just say, if we take our confession of Jesus as the Christ seriously, then like God's foolishness is wisdom, right? So the idea that God would strategically pick the most advanced anything, or the most powerful anything, or the wisest anything, or the strongest anything on the terms we would assess it, right? Like looking at ancient civilizations, I think is wrong. I think part of the problem in the church today is we think that the smartest and wisest, most affluent parts of the church experience of God is normative for everyone else, and then impose it. Like there's so many times we privilege with a hermeneutic of Caesar and not a hermeneutic of Christ. And so God choosing Israel and then choosing to remain faithful to Israel, and then Israel figuring out what it even means to be chosen, is really connected to, Walter Brueggemann calls it the scandal of particularity. And I talk about that in Divine Self-Investment.
Yes,
but
you do.
The part of it I think that is good to think about it in this is, if you're thinking of just like the mythopoetic picture of the human predicament in the Hebrew scriptures, when it gets to the Tower of Babylon, right? Everyone gets these different languages and stuff. God's like, top-down communication to everybody at once, not working. They say no and try to take my job. They don't even do theirs. It's full of like lots of problems at this point, right? And so what does God do? Is God invests in a particular community whose very identity is to receive blessing and extend it to others. And so the choosing of Israel is the choosing of a particular, but the horizon's always universal. But it's universal because God has cooperative community, a covenantal partnership for blessing the world. And that's how Israel understood their own identity. That doesn't mean God doesn't have similar ways of relating to other cultures, contexts, and peoples. I'm just saying, like, as inheritors of it.
I was just about to say this might be a topic you and I actually disagree on, but then you threw that last phrase in there, and maybe we don't disagree. Because I would answer the question about why God chose these goat herders, the Jewish people, by saying God chooses everybody. God didn't just single out some to communicate with, to reveal. I have no problem thinking God is trying to reveal to every person, every group, at every time. And some people listen better. Some people save their records better. Some people are people of the book and other people are not. Some people get the benefit of political powers on their side. When I'm talking, again, early church, sometimes the Caesars helped or hurt them. Anyway, so maybe what you said at the end sounds closer to what I would want to say, and that is the Jewish people are not chosen as if God picked them instead of others, but they're they either responded better than some, they kept records of it better, they had a way of lasting and not going extinct. There's more contingent factors, I think, in my way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to deny the contingency. I was just trying,
Okay.
like if you just take the question straightforward,
Yeah.
it it asks why did God choose Israel? So that was the language I was using. But
Gotcha.
but the way I would put it is, um, the uh, if Abraham and Sarah's act of faith hadn't happened, you would not have ever gotten Isaiah talking about
Yeah,
lying
that's
down with lambs and stuff.
right.
You wouldn't have got Mary. You wouldn't have got Jesus. But that doesn't mean the Logos or the Sophia wouldn't have been ever present and always active in each
Yeah.
moment of becoming. But
You also wouldn't
because,
have Islam, would you?
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But because of that, well, I guess it's the Sarah bit maybe, but
Yeah, that's right.
you know what I mean? Like but because the fidelity of God covenantally has correspondence with the community's identity, and that has a history, you have a growth in thematization of both sides. They come to
Nice.
understand their own identity more, and
Yeah.
God's identity becomes to reside more in the community. But that's not it's progressive revelation as if it's determined.
Right,
It's
right.
the experiential encounter with a living covenanted community before it's God.
Yeah.
But that testimony is so contextual, right? That's why the New Testament is trying to figure out how Gentiles even get to taste that fruit. And that's why being a Marcionite and an anti-Semitic and all those things are just horrible as Christians, because
Right, right.
like we're grafted in at best, anyway. So
I never even thought of until today the possibility that someone might think that progressive revelation was like a necessary rolling out of information on God's part. But yeah, I could see someone might go that route, but it just is so unappealing to me. I never even came across that thought, never entered my mind.
well,
Anyway.
as someone who's been a Whitehead fan in a Hegel seminar and being told consistently, Tripp, you're reading him as if Whitehead.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And I
Yeah,
was like,
that would make sense.
I was like, well, then he should tell me you're welcome. All right, so we got one more question.
Okay.
But remember, anyone can join our group, openrelationaltheology.com, going line by line through the creeds, February and March. You're going to answer this first because the wind just blew the door open to my basement and it is freezing. The question is, what are 3 books that changed your mind? Is there a nugget of goodness you would share from it?
Oh my goodness. 3 books.
Since there are plenty, it's not like the top 3. They said top. I was like, no basket.
Yeah.
But 3 books that changed your mind. What's a nugget you would take from them?
Yeah. Okay. I'll pick my first one. And hopefully when Tripp gets back, we'll agree that I don't have to do all 3 at once. We can go back and forth. Very specific book, an edited volume by John Polkinghorne called The Work of Love, Creation as Kenosis. It was a collection of about 10 or 12 essays written by theologians, philosophers, and scientists, teasing out what kenosis theology might look like. And people written from a process perspective, more classical theist perspective, and sort of mixed here and there. One of the essays was written by Keith Ward. And in his essay, I don't know exactly how he said it, but it sparked in my mind what I now call essential kenosis. The idea that God's self-giving, others-empowering love could be something God necessarily does because it's God's nature. Because almost everybody that I'd read up to that point used kenosis language as a kind of voluntary thing. Well, God doesn't have to give it. Jürgen Moltmann would say God chooses to withdraw to allow space for creation to be free. And that's most kenotic theologians have a voluntary view. But something Keith said in that essay, and I don't even remember what it was, but he was kind of moving toward the direction that I picked up and then have developed in several books since. So there's my first one. Tripp, let's go back and forth so I don't have to try to think of three in a row.
Okay,
You share
so
one.
what was the name of that book though? Because
Creation as Kenosis, or no,
yeah,
the work of love was the title. The subtitle was Creation as Kenosis.
and if you join the group, uh, uh, Tom and I
Oh, that's
read that
right.
article
Oh, that's right.
and discuss it for an hour and a half. So
I've forgotten about that. Oh,
we
yeah.
did. So that was going to be one of mine, but I'm not going to pick that. If you join the group on the resource page for the group. So once you join, you go to the resource page. We add everything throughout the class in it. So you can always go to one place. You can use it for a small group. We don't care. We're proselytizing open and relational theology.
That's right.
But we put a previous group we did together in the group. So we read 6 different open relational theologians: Karen Baker Fletcher, Marjorie Suhaki, Terrence Fretheim, Keith Ward, John Polkinghorne,
Clark Pinnock?
Clark Pinnock.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we read those, but the Keith Ward article we read is the one you're talking about.
Oh,
It's in that book, but they can get the PDF and hear our discussion of it if they join. That's hilarious. So I'll pick a different one. That was one of the ones I was thinking of. One of the most influential books that changed my mind dramatically was Scandalous Providence by E. Frank Tupper. It is a narrative doctrine of providence using the Jesus story. I think my interview with him is in the top 5 most downloaded on Homebrewed Christianity. So probably most of you have heard it, but if you haven't, you should go listen to it. But it is, I read it when trying to process multiple family members, like cancer diagnoses, a number of other personal crises and things. And the chapter on the Bethlehem massacre, like when Herod takes out all the babies, and like, what do you do about that? And that to me was like a chapter like that. You pick that in a Providence book, and the liturgical cycle skips it. Became a real helpful place for me to be honest about like God's relationship to time, foreknowledge, all that kind of stuff, and our ability to connect to it. And then in the like cross and resurrection chapters, the ability to give yourself to hope without having security because you refuse to leave behind the crosses of the people you love and the crosses of the people that we put people on. It gave me permission to be honest more about my faith and the horror of existence at the same time. Anyway, so.
Good. All right. For my second one, as I was thinking, I want to show you 2 books, both by Hans Kung. Does God Exist? On Being a Christian. Came out, I think, in the 80s. In the late 80s, early 90s, I was a youth pastor in Walla Walla, Washington. I didn't have great conversation partners. This is pre-internet, pre-podcast chat groups. And so I had books, and I went through these big honking books for my morning devotions for about a year and a half. And one of the issues I was wrestling with at the time was the relationship between faith and reason. I didn't want a blind faith approach to my Christianity. On the other hand, I couldn't make sense of everything being personally rational and reasonable. It was pretty obvious to me. We have assumptions that we bring to any kind of thing. We can't be totally objective. And in Does God Exist, especially, but also on Being a Christian, Kung wrestles with these things and offers the category of reasonable trust. And I've always just thought there's something about that. Trust is kind of the faith element. You can't know with certainty, but it's not blind faith or irrational trust. It's reasonable trust. And just that little idea kind of solidified in my mind. Okay, I don't have to just, say it's all mystery, or if I can't deduce it with logic and mathematics, it can't be true. There is a place for both reason and faith.
That's a good one. All right, my second one, Richard Horsley, Jesus and Empire. Jesus Empire. He's a historical Jesus scholar. Does a lot with early church, like the development of Christology and looking at the historical Jesus and the way that not just the mission of Jesus, but even the self-understanding of the resurrected Christ in the early church was counter-imperial. I read the book first in maybe mid-20s and early 20s, processing post 9/11 and the church is becoming a giant embarrassment. And when I realized that Jesus would like to give the war profiteers and invasion chanters quite a hard time. There's nothing more exciting for a Baptist preacher's kid than learning that you can deconstruct the ugly parts of your religion with Jesus. And that book enabled it in ways that the times I would think I could have most easily set aside my faith, that was there. And like I wanted to be, challenging to a group of people. Like, if you aren't even one of them, how are they going to listen? But if you're like, I'm gonna be a minister when I grow up, and George Bush is a war criminal. Hashtag Jesus. So, I remember that, and I've read that book multiple times. His book he did on the liberation of Christmas was also really good and helped me. And all the Christmas stuff, when you bring people show back up at your church, it's like, how do you use the Christmas narratives to supplant the church being the occasional nostalgia function for civic religion and imperial blindedness? So
cool. All right, my final book. I'm going to pick a book that came out 5-7 years ago, something like that, by a mutual friend of ours, Ryan Mullins. The title of the book is The End of a Timeless God. Now, the book I didn't have a aha moment, like I learned something really radically new. I came to the book already believing God experiences time like we do, and that God is not in all senses timeless. That's part of being an open and relational thinker. But what Ryan did in this book was help me realize that I had much stronger basis to believe that God experiences time like we do. And he did it in part by pointing out that all of the kinds of actions we think about God doing that are described in the Bible, like saving, forgiving, creating, redeeming, sanctifying, all these things presuppose sequences of time in God's life. So God saves because something happened previously that needed salvation. God creates, but prior to that, God wasn't creating, or, all these kinds of things that if we take these verbs seriously, we ought to think God experiences time rather than being somehow outside time or timeless.
Mm-hmm. That's a good example. I mean, and we'll talk more about this in the class about the temporality stuff and things, but it really is and we had a number of questions that came in about divine simplicity and all that kind of stuff. So we should make sure at some point in the Q&A we spend time on it. Now so if you have a theology podcast, you read lots of books. So
yeah,
I recently just finished Catherine Keller's next book. Facing Apocalypse, Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances. Okay, so one, Catherine Keller is top 5 living theologian. She's and if amazing. You don't agree with me, you're probably not a real Christian. Second, she already wrote one really good book on eschatology.
Yeah.
This one's better. This is okay. Revelation, you got the 7 letters, right? If you don't know that, you're lucky. But that's a high quality joke. I was thinking of that one. But so the book of Revelation, the end of Scripture, right? Like gets turned into this text throughout church history where people are predicting the end. Catherine takes the text up, writes 7 different chapters connected to the 7 letters, but not as apocalypse about the end and Jesus coming back, but apocalypse as in like the revelation of the perversity that's present, which is what's actually going on in the text. That's counter-imperial text. Like most biblical scholars are like, oh, the book of Revelation, you mean where it like uses apocalyptic language for God sticking it to Rome and imperial power? Yeah, that one. She does that and it was written in lockdown from coronavirus during the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests, thinking about the horizon of all the problems facing us. And oh my God, it is so good. Like, I would get this excited about Catherine Keller books in general. Okay.
Yeah.
I finished it last night and cut and pasted a text that I sent to multiple people. It was just like, I don't know when it's available, but you're going to have to read it. And mostly because I was hoping they would ask her to read the proofs because I want to talk to someone about it. It's like everything you want. Let me, hold on. I'm sitting my computer on my notebook about this book. I made a list of, these were my notes for when I talked to her about this book. This is how good it is. She wants to talk about the metaphors, like metaphor, but the metaphors of apocalyptic imagery in the way it calls forth the revelation of fatal patterns of our relationality. Oh, it's so good. That's what I'm talking about. What is the apocalypse? It dream reads. It's a dream read. It reads the dreams of the people, right? The apocalyptic dreams, our fears, the way it shapes us. It's a dream read, of the collective consciousness of a people fearful of scarcity. She talks about the apocalyptic dodge of the religion of the dominant. And the whole thing's framed where she's trying to resist an optimistic denial of apocalyptic language and then like the literal dismissal, right? Like, oh, anyway, it is just so good. And granted, you're like talking to me less than 24 hours when I finished it and emailed the publisher and was like, I'm a Catherine Keller fan, but and it's written in a way like you don't have to know Catherine Keller to read it, Tom. Like, On the Mysteries, her book that a normal person could approach. This is more approachable and still has all the poetic fun.
Oh, fun. Heck, would you be able to incorporate some of the ideas of that book when we get to the end of the creed? Or is it something you'll insert when all throughout the creed as we're working through?
Ooh, that's a fun question. There's definitely bits of both. See, the problem is, like, I don't know how to. I can't like be treated seriously when I'm as playful with language as Catherine Keller.
Oh, Catherine's amazing.
You know what I mean?
No one can compare to her.
I feel like what she accomplishes with the ability to pull together all these different themes and then like different poetics from different like poets and then imagery, like, and this one like is using history and stuff about different apocalyptic and millenarian movements. Anyway, like like when she starts weaving stuff, like Tripp like tries to understand stuff and then come up with pop culture jokes about it. like she's like the person you want if it was sports in charge of your like she's like the general manager who like actually cultivates a team culture and like makes all the parts work together because she could see it all and weave it all. And then I'm the one you want as your like color commentator for your team. Like you're like, he's sold out. He's kind of funny. Normal people can approach him. It's all good. That's what Tripp is.
You don't have to know Moneyball to figure things out.
No, Tripp doesn't need Moneyball.
That's a good analogy. She's amazing. And she's a great person too. So I look forward to getting that book as well.
The Tupper book is Scandalous Providence. Someone just asked, Tanner book. Do we mention a Tanner book? It's Catherine Keller, not Tanner. It was Keller. Catherine Keller's new book is Facing Apocalypse. Catherine Tanner, on the other hand, also has plenty of good text, but we ran out of numbers to pick.
Yeah.
But anyway, so thank you all for hanging out. We have tons of other questions. We'll probably do this again. We're definitely going to be doing it in our group, openrelationaltheology.com. But anytime I can get Tom to hang out with me.
Hey, I always enjoy hanging out with you. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And thanks again to everybody who participated. And sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. Obviously, we'd love to do that. But like Tripp said, a lot of the questions, at least I saw coming up or that were sent in ahead, are questions we are going to address as we move through the creed and do our commentary on line by line. Actually, sometimes we go word by word. We're so meticulous, but at least line by line. So we'll get around to answering those questions in the class in February and March.
Oh yeah. And so Tom, the one other thing I wanted to ask is, which of the lines are you most fearful of dealing with? You know, we had a Twitter poll.
Yes.
And which one are you most fearful with? Mine's Almighty, and I'm sure you know why, but like you didn't pick that one because for some reason,
well, for me, the Born of the
decided
Virgin
to try to
Mary
recapitulate
it. For me, the Born of the Virgin Mary one has always been a toughie because maybe in part because I got called in front of my denominational leadership because I didn't say I affirmed it the way they wanted me to. So maybe that's just sort of flashbacks or something. But
that whole line of the creed is just triggering for Tom.
That's it.
He's like, oh, denominational. What's going on?
Yeah. But besides the political dimension, you know, just trying to figure out why things are there and what's at stake. That's important.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for hanging out. Looking forward to more fun with you. I think the link's under the post, openrelationaltheology.com. Definitely invite people and stuff. Like when it's give whatever you want, like it's like a majority of people won't give anything. So don't even feel bad. Like we mostly want to hang out with people and do it. And then those that have the ability to give can. So like no negative judgment, like don't feel any pressure. I know that I've gotten emails, Tom, where they're like, well, this is a religious thing. So like, should I feel guilty that I don't? No. We're proselytizers for open and relationship. If you sign up, we promise to spend 2 months trying to convince you that open relational theology is a viable way of expressing the faith and possibly using most of the lines of the creed.
The problem, though, with you saying don't feel any pressure is we started off this whole thing placing pressure on people to not give us more than $1 million. And now you're being duplicitous.
No, but don't do that. Don't do that either.
Some people are going to say, man, I just want to give 10 million, but I can't. Come on. That's pressure.
But if people join since then, just know that Tom left the back door open for more than $1 million donations. That's what happened earlier. I have my standards. I don't do more than that. Unless you're, going to endow a chair near my family where I can be around them and use my degree. Then I have a completely different set of standards. Okay. I do. That's true. I should have said there was a limit, Tom. But thank you for being my friend and doing this. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. I am looking forward to it also, Tripp.
Awesome. And we'll put the links to the books on the post with this once I post it on Homebrewed. So if you were chasing down the links or whatever, I'll have them all linked there underneath it. So no worries. All right. Peace.